Hi everyone, Carl Steele here with what I think is going to be the last video for English 4113. So this is for the 26th class, which is tomorrow. I have an image here that I saw at the Whitney Museum on Friday or Saturday. It's a photo called Egg Nude by a photographer named Edgar Cohen, who was born in 1936, from a exhibition that focuses on the output of a group of Black photographers working mostly in New York. And I just thought this image of a woman bent over and huddled like this just reminded me of, there's a bit in Beloved where Beloved forms a similar shape. Maybe she's trying to make herself into a turtle, but there's also a kind of egg shape to it. So I just found this image really striking. I believe you have free access to the Whitney as CUNY students. You may want to call to confirm that, but I'd recommend the show. I found it very moving. So today's reading is we're going to be talking about the article, What Shall We Do with White People by William Wilson from 1860 from the Anglo-African magazine. The driving question of this short piece is this: what then shall we Anglo-Africans do with these white people? What shall we do with them? It may seem strange that a people so crushed and trodden upon, so insignificant as Anglo-Africans, should even ask the question, what shall we do with the whites? But as we discover, simply by posing the question and trying to see things from their perspective, from the perspective of Black people in America, everything changes, right? There's a tendency, I think, to say, no, but people were generally in support of slavery at this time. These are just the morals of the time. And we often find this, we're talking about anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, for example, or in the modern era, or anti-Black racism or support of slavery. But of course, the people who were against anti-Semitism were, of course, Jews. The people who are against anti-Black racism and white supremacy in slavery are, of course, Black people. So changing the point of view to center the marginalized or oppressed group, of course, changes the entire texture of how reality seems to function. So here's kind of the way that this text is functioning. It reminds me of pieces that do this. Try to imagine what the US politics would be like if it was being covered in the way that, say, the Washington Post, the New York Times, or CNN tends to cover countries in Africa or in Southeast Asia, for example. And so Karen Attia, who's a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, poses this question in May 29, 2020. How Western media would cover Minneapolis if it happened in another country. So she asks this in the Washington Post. And she just basically steps to the outside of America and writes like this. In recent years, the international community has sounded the alarm on deteriorating political and human rights situation in the United States under the regime, notice that word, regime, of Donald Trump. Now, as the country marks 100,000 deaths from the coronavirus pandemic, now we're up to about 250,000, the former British colony finds itself in a downward spiral of ethnic violence. The fatigue and paralysis of the international community are evident in its silence, America experts say. The idea that there are America experts, right? Are they Americans? No, they're just people who live outside who are experts in our country. The country has been rocked by several viral videos depicting extrajudicial executions of Black ethnic minorities by state security forces. So rather than calling them the police, state security forces, that alienates us from understanding them in the way we typically do. Uprisings erupted in the northern city of Minneapolis after a video circulated online of the killing of a Black man, George Floyd, after being attacked by a security force agent, not a police officer, but a security force agent. Trump took to Twitter, calling Black protesters thugs and threatening to send in military force. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, he declared, right? And you can imagine how this would be covered if it were happening in what's supposedly a third world country, right? It would look something like this. So, in this article, William Wilson does a similar thing. He basically flips the way that white people tend to write about Black people and just turns around and applies it to white people. And so we find these arguments in this work. Can whites engage in self-government? He says, evidently they can't. He says, well, the wars against Britain, the War of Revolution, and also the War of 1812 are basically a betrayal of the motherland. The war against Mexico, which had concluded in I think the 1840s, was basically bullying. and whatever the lofty ideals of the founding of the United States, the present day, which is 1860, it's now chaos. Clearly, white people are not able to govern themselves. Is there law? Yes, but now it's just in the service of cruelty designed to support slavery. There's Christian preaching. We can say this is a Christian nation, but it seems to, by and large, be designed to support the existing system, which is the system of slavery. And he says here, here's a basic summary of how it all works. They commenced with the plunder of the Indian, theft of the African, followed by the grossest wrongs upon the Afro-American, and broils with their neighbors without, and stripes among themselves within, as they fight and attack each other, the fruits of which are thorough dissatisfaction and agitation, right? Can whites govern themselves? Evidently not. So the follow-up question is this: what then shall we Anglo-Africans do with them? How save them and their country from their sure and impending fate? What agencies shall we put forth to arrest so direful a calamity? These are indeed serious questions, and reviewed in the light of earnestness demand, if possible, immediate solution. To demand, if possible, an immediate solution. So if you're faced with that, how do you even write about this, right? It's basically a satire, and it just sort of flips the script, and it's really kind of hard to tell where else we could possibly take this. Say if you want to write a paper on this. Well, the thing that's really striking to me is this passage here, where William Wilson writes, "God in his all-wise purpose has reserved this fair land for other and higher and nobler purposes than a theater for the exhibition of prejudices, bitter hates, fierce strifes, oppressions, frauds. On the contrary, it was, so to speak, reserved for centuries, like a sealed book, and then thrown open just when needed by the great author himself, that men of every tongue and clime and hue should gather thereon and perfect their development." This is a kind of manifest destiny, and it's one that's saying, why can't we all live here in this new America? And it raises the question of the relationship between Black rights and the rights of Native Americans, and the way that they seem to be at odds with one another. How do you resolve this issue when Black people in this country are so evidently dispossessed, and Indigenous people are even, in many ways, dispossessed even more strongly because it was their land originally. And so we can find evidence, of course, of Black people who are also Native American. And so here's a man named Mr. Graham, who is a descendant of Africans who were enslaved by Cherokees, but he also is Cherokee. And so he claims that he has a double culture, and you can find many examples of this, of people who have blended identity. So the question is, where do we situate Black claims for justice in relation to Indigenous claims for justice? And this, what shall we do with white people? Because it sets it up as a Black versus white thing, and thinks of Indians as only these people who are dispossessed by white people, really calls upon us to have a more complicated answer. So if you were going to write a paper on this, I don't think anybody will, but this is the way to do it, is to find this kind of conceptual gap or slippage in the thing you're looking at and think, how can I explore this? And if you're going to do that, you might look at something like this. There's this book by a woman named Tiffany Lathobo King, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, where she's trying to think about these two things together. And her metaphor is the shoal, which is not a shore. It's not the edge of something, but something that kind of, a little wave of sand before we get to the shore that slows things down or grabs hold of us, right? And that's a driving metaphor for her book. And one of the images that she analyzes is this image of a statue of Columbus. I believe it's in Boston, that's got Black Lives Matter spray painted on it. So Columbus is, of course, can be frequently understood as an image of oppression against Native Americans, not so much against Black people. Well, here we have Black Lives Matter painted on a statue of Columbus. And what is the relationship between these two things? And again, if you were going to write about this article by William Wilson, I think that would probably be the most productive thing, because we can say, well, it's a satire, and that's very straightforward. But then there's this attempt we can try to grapple with this very difficult problem that this article raises. So let me illustrate one other thing for you. There is the question of how you write an annotated bibliography. And what you want is 2 or 3 sentences that really can give someone the key points of the article or the thing you read so they can read it and understand what's happening without having to read the whole thing themselves. So to be as clear as possible and to be as information dense as possible, that's your goal. And so here we have that article. I've done it in Chicago style citation, Wilson, William J, Ethiop, pseudonym, What Shall We Do with White People? Anglo-African Magazine, February 1860, 41 to 45. You probably have access to the Chicago Manual of Style through the Brooklyn College databases. So don't just let a computer tell you what to do in terms of your citations. Look it up, because I had to look up how to do pseudonyms. So here we go. Here's my annotation of that. A satire, this article's primary aim may be to simply reverse the kinds of arguments Thomas Jefferson made about Black people in his notes on Virginia. It argues that although the injustice, cruelty, and deception of white rule in the United States of America indicates that they are not fit for self-government, it is impractical to return them to Europe. Perhaps they will one day fade away. And so I'm trying to kind of capture the way this article doesn't actually resolve the question. It poses the question without ever answering it, because it's an impossible question to answer, right? And there's just this hope that maybe one day they will go away. So that's an example of, I think, a successful annotation. One last thing for you. I'm going to walk you through a chronology of all the texts we read this semester, just to give you a sense of basically the scope of what we've done. So here we go. From the Middle Ages, 1300, Cursor Mundi, 1326, Florus Historiarum. So I give you a translation of the Latin of that. 1330, the King of Tars. 1453, now we're starting to leave the Middle Ages. Gomes Ionistis Azarara, Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. 1510, very end of the Middle Ages, William Dunbar, My Lady with the Michaelilippus. 1587, now we're in the early modern period. William Harrison of the General Constitution and the Bodies of the Britons, so he's a contemporary of Shakespeare. Then in 1646, we're still in the early modern period, or getting into the Enlightenment, Thomas Brown's Pseudodoxia Epidemica. 1654, the laws in Barbados, a really key transformational point in the history of race and racism. 1688, Offerben's Orinoco. And now we're very much in the modern era. 1759, John Hawksworth's adaptation of Offerben's novel. 1768, an account of a savage girl caught wild in the woods of Champagne, very much the Enlightenment. And then keep going. 1785, Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which he published that year, but also in the early 19th century, we see it. 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, important text for the French Revolution. 1789, same year, Equiano's Interesting Narrative, which he publishes repeatedly over the next decade or so. 1797, Edward Rushton's letter to George Washington. Now we're in the 19th century. 1803, the letter of Dessalines to Jefferson. And in 1805, the Haitian Constitution, the one that legally declares all Haitian citizens Black. 1810, if you remember reading a little bit of this, Stanhope Smith's essay on the causes and varieties of complexion and figures in the human species. 1856, Francis Harper's poem, The Slave Mother, which is, and then 1856, the same year, Ralph Waldo Emerson's Race and English Traits, which is an interesting text to read alongside the William J. Wilson text. 1859, On the 14th Query of Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. 1860, William J. Wilson writing his Ethiop, What Shall We Do with White People, Anglo-African Magazine. And then the same year, I forgot to put it in, The Fugitive Slave Law and Its Victims, also 1860. Now we skip into the 20th century. 1945, Robert Hayden's poem, Middle Passage. That's the earliest version of it that he publishes, but he keeps working on it over the next 15 or 16 years. And then the latest text you read, which is Toni Morrison's Beloved. We also read critical work by Frans Fanon, by Cord Whitaker, by Saidiya Hartman, none of which I've included on here, but that's all from the 20th and 21st centuries. I also talked a great deal about Walderson's book, Afro-Pessimism, which was published this year in 2020, and so therefore counts as the latest book that we talked about this semester. And thank you so much for getting through all this with me, and I'll see you tomorrow.